Jenny's an associate professor of writing, rhetoric, and digital media at the University of Kentucky, and she's also the WPA there. She got her PhD here in 2005, yay, and she was an active member of the DWRL, one of our most famous alumni. And look, she gets at 3 in the afternoon on a Friday the 13th. She gets this. Her book, Distant Publics, came out in 2012, is that correct? 2012 at the University of Pittsburgh Press, and she's published just a ton of stuff in various journals and special issues on topics such as public rhetorics, affect theory, and rhetorical ecologies. Will Burdett is particularly interested in her work with the rhetorics of food. She's now at work on another book project tentatively entitled Awful Archives, and I believe what she's sharing with us today is a selection from that work in progress. And by the way, I just want to say that we're lucky. We're just lucky. We just lucked into this because she's actually here to run the Austin Marathon on Sunday. So we just said, will you? And she graciously agreed. So we lucked out on that one. We're very grateful. So though her husband, I noticed on Facebook just a bit ago, is reminding her that Austin is not her home, I hope you'll join me in welcoming her back home to Austin, to UT, and the DWRL.
So it really is, this is a big deal for me to come back, because I always live to come back and see, my acronyms are still going to be throwbacks, but you know, the DRC, the DWRL, CWRL, and DRW, all of them. I've loved all of them and all their carnations, so it's nice to come back home. But I'm also glad to be sharing this with you today because this is very much part of a new project that I'm doing, and this is really the first time that I've kind of formally brought this out, and I'm really glad to be doing it with you all because I'm hoping to hear feedback from smart people, which is exactly what I'll get. This comes from what will, as Diane said, it'll be a book called Awful Archives, and it's looking at different ways of approaching archives. And the way that I'm using the term archive, hopefully will unpack clearly enough, but I'm using it in a very broad sense. Lizard people, chemtrails, Illuminati, toxic fluoride in the water, radio-controlled chip implants, Jewish cabals, secret NASA technology, poison vaccinations, the shooting down of Pan Am Flight 103, government-sponsored brainwashing, sharks trained by the Mossad, Paul is dead, Tupac is alive. I'm talking about conspiracy theories here. And in thinking about how to combat the more insidious kinds of conspiracy theories, Cass Sunstein and Adrian Vermeule make the case that conspiracists simply need to be presented with more credible information that would eventually reveal the flaws in their conspiracies. They argue that conspiracy theories are difficult to correct due to their self-sealing quality. When contrary evidence is offered to conspiracy theorists that may disprove the theory, that evidence is often discarded as a lie, or it is absorbed into the larger structure of the overall theory itself. Sunstein and Vermeule describe conspiracy thinking as the, quote, result of a crippled epistemology or a degenerating research program in the form of a sharply limited number of relevant information sources. So, the remedy is to increase the available information sources to people who may find themselves encountering conspiracy discourse. So you might infiltrate the networks of online discussion boards where conspiracy discourse is happening, for example. This points to something we might call rhetoric's archival magnitude. More information, more sources, more research. Archival magnitude sees the rhetor reaching into available archives for greater degrees of evidence. And by archives, I mean those public artifacts, stories, pieces of information, data that we store away in personal, cultural, rhetorical databases. Sunstein and Vermeule pose rhetorical magnitude as the antidote to the sharply limited number of relevant information sources that conspiracy theorists draw from. In making this suggestion, then, they're calling upon a greater assumption at work in theories of argument. Greater archival magnitude seems to scale. It yields greater fidelity to actual states of affairs. It seems to scale to more warranted claims. Magnitude and scale seem to be linked together. More information and sources inevitably lead to greater rhetorical fidelity. I mean, after all, nobody ever asks for less evidence when making arguments. Yet the relationship between magnitude and scale, between quantities of evidence and accuracy with respect to actual states of affairs, deserves to be examined. So what is the relationship between magnitude and scale? Although Sunstein and Vermeule draw from the assumption that magnitude and scale are closely aligned, the very conspiracy theorists they write about also draw from this same connection between magnitude and scale. Yet the more information conspiracists gather, the further they seem to move from what we would call an accurate perspective. And yet, the less than accurate claims seem to have some kind of relationship to the magnitude they're continuously building. So my talk today examines the tenuous relationship between what I'm calling rhetorical magnitude and scale. And I turn to the Aristotelian concept of magnitude, or megathos, which contains an aesthetic dimension. While more evidence does not necessarily guarantee better insight into reality, it does promise a different type of impact. So today I use the example of conspiracy theories and a somewhat different example of big data in order to disentangle the relationship between magnitude and scale. So first, let me just briefly paint you a picture of archival magnitude in conspiracy discourse. Last year, I spent about a year doing field work and research with a type of conspiracy theorists that we generally would call truthers. Mostly 9/11 truthers, as they themselves call them. As I began to interview 9/11 truthers and I joined online discussion groups, Facebook groups devoted to 9/11 truth, as they call it, I very quickly found myself drowning in details and information and images and texts that circulated across these various groups. The archive in conspiracy discourse is huge and also microscopic, often comprised of time-lapsed images and still frames in order to give second-by-second analysis. Such fine-grained attention to detail was seen, for example, in the truther community that sprung up literally overnight after the Boston Marathon bombing. Many of the postings in online sites like Reddit and Facebook included intensive archival work. So consider this posting from a conspiracy website written only a few hours after the events in Boston. Concerning the bombings of the Boston Marathon, if you view the Family Guy episode, Turban Cowboy, which was aired on March 17, 2013 on Fox, you will see a Boston Marathon with people being killed, a library, terrorists. You will hear 2 explosions, bombs detonated via cell phone, and see 1 explosion of a bridge from a bomb detonated via cell phone. The conspiracy floated in these groups at this time was that the bombing was a false flag, which was perpetrated by the federal government in order to clamp down on civil liberties, take away our guns. Images of the bombing aftermath became a focus in this archival material. One of the most frequently cited images is of a now legless victim named Jeff Bauman. And Bauman's horrific picture, which you've all probably seen at some point from the bombing, was shared alongside an image of a legless veteran named Nick Vogt, who resembled Bauman a bit. Boston truthers were adamant that Bauman and Vogt are the same man, and instead of being a victim, he's a crisis actor who played along with a fake bombing. Countless versions of this argument, always juxtaposing Vogt and Bauman, circulated in sites like Twitter and Reddit and Facebook. Very similar accusations about crisis actors staging attacks and phony aftermath also surrounded Sandy Hook, elementary school shootings, Gene Rosen, and also the Aurora shooting as well. Gene Rosen, who by all accounts was a real hero in the midst of the Sandy Hook tragedy, describes being barraged by by taunting emails and phone calls because Sandy Hook truthers accused him of being an actor in a stage hoax. Magnitude can also be seen in the shape of conspiracy texts themselves, which show a tendency toward accumulation. Casey Boyle actually pointed this out to me. So you can consider squeezed-in lettering, built up and piled on images, paragraphs that appear in conspiracy texts that seem to have no paragraph breaks, no beginnings, no endings. This is something that one of the 9/11 truthers gave me, and he actually gave me many of these. And though it's hard to see from this image, there's lettering all around, almost everywhere. None of it seems to go together. So some of it seems to be against Obama, the one world government, Zionists, anything that can be thrown in there. There's a propensity toward magnitude here in all of this that's undeniable. Yet conspiracy discourse hardly ever seems to equally scale up to reflect a better understanding of actual states of affairs. So what exactly is going on? To better understand magnitude, I tend to turn to Aristotle and his perspective on size. As it turns out, Aristotle has a lot to say about magnitude. Thomas Farrell's done some of the best work of pointing this out. Farrell writes, Aristotle wasn't much noted as a tropologist, but in the Rhetoric, the single most frequently recurring commonplace is that of quantity, degree, largesse, magnitude. It's as broad as it is long. What looks large from a distance, close up is never that big. It's interesting, by contrast, to reflect upon the poetic understanding of magnitude. The Greek word is the same, megathos, but now we find a quite different inflection placed upon meaning and function. End quote. That was Farrell. Farrell shows how megathos wends and winds throughout both the Rhetoric and the Poetics. Magnitude has a poetic impact to it that is not necessarily the same as its relation to degree or accounting. So, as Aristotle tells us in the Poetics, a beautiful object, whether it be a living organism or any whole composed of parts, must not only have an orderly arrangement of parts, but must also be of a certain magnitude. For beauty depends on magnitude and order. Hence, a very small organism cannot be beautiful, for the view of it is confused, the object being seen in an almost imperceptible moment of time. Nor again can one of very vast size be beautiful, for as the eye cannot take it in all at once, the unity and sense of the whole is lost to the spectator. As, for instance, if there were a 1,000-mile-long thing. As, therefore, in the case of animate bodies and organisms, a certain magnitude is necessary, and a magnitude which may be easily embraced in one view. So Aristotle tells us that a very tiny thing, a very giant thing, cannot be beautiful because we can't take them in. Farrell points out that Aristotle's magnitude has this aesthetic component. Farrell's example is the friendly conversation where you ask somebody, hey, how's it going? Too little detail is unwanted. That would be rude. Too much detail is obnoxious. So the good response, the fitting one, is the beautiful aesthetic of, I'm good, how are you? Things are going well. Part of what makes conspiracy theories so weird to many of us is the gross disproportionality of their evidence. Its magnitude isn't aesthetically right. But the archival magnitude of conspiracy theory seems to raise two different streams to consider, one aesthetic, one epistemic. But as Farrell argues, rhetorical magnitude does not necessarily perform two different functions, aesthetic and epistemic, but generates what we might call an epistemic aesthetic. Aristotle's sense of megathos pushes us to, quote, set aside totalizing disjunctions, the aesthetic versus the epistemic, end quote. In short, magnitude itself and its aesthetic impact in particular are part of an argument. So still another way of seeing this archival magnitude is through its epideictic function. Scholars like Ned O'Gorman have pointed out how Aristotle links together megathos and epideictic. O'Gorman writes, epideictic, as the aspect of discourse especially given to the invocation of magnitude, provides for the polis through lexis as fantasia images of honor and shame or virtue and vice that can be sized up and interpreted to a logic of scale. How great was his courage? How expansive was her generosity? Epideictic, in the most basic rhetorical pedagogy, then, is about amplification. So here's how Aristotle instructs us on epideictic prose. Even if there's no comparison with the famous, one should compare the person praised with the many, since superiority, even over them, seems to denote excellence. In general, among the classes of things common to all speeches, amplification is most at home in those that are epideictic, for these take up actions that are agreed upon, so that what remains is to clothe the actions with greatness and beauty. In my lazier moments of teaching the three types of discourse, judicial, deliberative, epideictic, I tend to fall back on that temporal distinction that judicial is about what happened in the past, deliberative is about what happened in the future, and epideictic is about some kind of nebulous now. And to be honest, this distinction is not very useful, except it has a nice sense of harmony, past, future, present. But as Debbie Haughey points out, quote, the very task of epideictic rhetoric is to rhetorically, through a host of images furnished by memory, by vivid comparison, and projected into the future, produce magnitude, thereby achieving density by calling upon multiple images and piling on excessive detail. So epideictic is about magnitude, accumulation. Moreover, the notion of epideictic as merely ornamental speech also does not quite get at epideictic's more powerful function. Jeffrey Walker notes that Aristotle does not merely define epideictic speech as ceremonial or ornamental. Aristotle distinguishes deliberative and judicial discourse audiences, who are expected to be kritai, or judges, from an audience to epideictic, who are expected to be theoros, those who make observations. Walker writes, the role of the theoros, in short, is not to make rulings, but to form opinions about and in response to the discourse presented. So, epideictic discourse is not a third triangulated piece of discourse, as I sometimes teach, I think I did last week, but underlies the work of deliberative and judicial rhetoric. Epideictic, continues Walker, shapes the fundamental ground, the deep commitments and presuppositions that will underlie and ultimately determine and debate in particular pragmatic forms, end quote. For this reason, Walker proposes to think about discourse as primal to public discourse, or as Ned O'Gorman puts it, quote, we can understand the epideictic function of discourse as primary, central, and primal, end quote. The epideictic function, which works through beauty, gives salience to deliberation and to judicial discourse. So for Aristotle, then, megathos is both accumulation and an order that we take in as just right. It hits the sweet spot. Accumulation is the constituent of that aesthetic just right sensation. Accumulation is the activity that generates that sensation we come to call epideictic. Accumulation is thus also the activity that underlies decision and debate, or what we call public discourse. In some sense, this means that when we argue or take issue with the discourse of conspiracy theorists, we may find that the aesthetic, epistemic, epideictic function slips past our grasp. David Hume helps us to understand why this is when he makes a useful distinction between sentiment and a kind of judgment. Hume writes, all sentiment is right because sentiment has a reference to nothing beyond itself, and it is always real. But all determinations of the understanding are not right because they do have a reference to something beyond themselves, to wit, to real matters of fact, and they are not always comfortable to that standard, end quote. Addressing the judgment that arises from the sentiment is one thing. We can do that in response to the content of the archival magnitude of conspiracy theorists, for example, about their bad conspiracy theories. But, as Hume points out, it's nearly impossible to argue with the impact of sentiment insofar as it has that aesthetic impact. The aesthetic is always true. So I want to consider another way of thinking about this aesthetic, epistemic, epideictic function. Conspiracy discourse is certainly big, but it definitely doesn't match the bigness of what we've fondly come to know as big data. Rather than examining big data in terms of evangelism or approbation, however, the notion of magnitude as aesthetic, epistemic, allows us to understand a different kind of rhetorical impact that is missed in both poles of this big data debate that is unfolding. Big data evangelists seem to have a faith in the fidelity of magnitude's relation to scale, while doubters do not. Now, does big data actually scale up to give us a more accurate perspective on the world? It's worth debating. But even if we uncouple scale and magnitude, however, we're still left with something different. In his essay, View from Nowhere, Nathan Jurgensen hits at what that something different might be. Jurgensen writes, as the name suggests, big data is about size. Many proponents of big data claim that massive databases can reveal a whole new set of truths because of the unprecedented quantity of information they contain. But the big in big data is also used to denote a qualitative difference, that aggregating a certain amount of information makes data pass over into a different sort of knowledge altogether. Now, Jurgensen is not a proponent of big data, but he notes that something passes over into what he called a different sort of knowledge altogether. And the term knowledge here is a tricky word, but it's worth pursuing. At some point, magnitude passes over from evidence into a different function, one that might be best described in terms of its effects. So to get at what I mean here, I'll just briefly describe to you a project that some of my colleagues in geography at the University of Kentucky have been working on. My colleagues are especially interested in critical GIS, or the study of large data gathered across the GeoWeb. And one of the most interesting projects they do is the Twitter mapping project. So if I have my location enabled on my Twitter, which not all of us do, anytime I tweet something, the hashtag or keywords can then be taken up, and they take these up, and then they aggregate huge amounts of data to see, where certain things trending and tweeting. So during a Kentucky basketball game, you can probably guess where the most hashtag BBN, which is the hashtag Bluegrass Basketball Nation, or during the Arab Spring, where's the hashtag Arab Spring trending, what parts of the world? One of their ongoing projects is a comparative mapping of various tweets. Many of their maps, like the beer versus church comparisons, or the juggalos versus polar bears map, have been picked up and shared in such publications as USA Today, CNN, Slate. Their zombie maps are some of the most interesting, so they're the most widely discussed. So I'll show one. This is the brains versus salads mapping. This is a map of, if you're a social media using zombie, you can see where more tweets are coming in, who's tweeting more about salads versus brains. And this is taken over a period of about a year. As you can see, if you are a zombie, you may want to stay away from the East Coast. Many more salads, more people talking about salads. Europe, and it kind of looks like India may have some good possibilities as far as people talking about juicy brains. We could also appreciate their y'all mapping. These were geotagged tweets referencing y'all between July 2012 and March 2014. So the dark green places where you might expect more people using the term y'all in their tweets over these 2 years. Okay, so these maps don't necessarily scale up to any kind of reliable claims, but they are beautiful maps. To put this in another set of terms, we may also say that accumulation allows for a beautiful clarity. Edward Tufte describes this in terms of macro and micro readings of visual images, and his example is Constantine Anderson's map of Midtown Manhattan, which this image is taken from. The map drills down to nitty-gritty details like telephone booths, bus shelters, sidewalk planters. Tufte writes, "This fine texture of exquisite detail leads to personal micro-readings, individual stories about the data, shops visited, hotels stayed at, walks taken, office windows on a floor worked at, all in the extended context of an entire building, street, neighborhood." So I walked on that street. That street corner was where my husband yelled at a taxi who almost ran us over after he ran a red light. I wonder who works in that office tower on the 30th floor. Tufte says, detail cumulates into larger coherent structure, those thousands of tiny windows, when seen at a distance, gray into surfaces to form a whole building. From the accumulation and magnitude comes the aesthetic epistemic of taking in something both fantastic and fantastically coherent in my own experience. So Tufte's design axiom from the lesson of Anderson's map is to clarify, add detail. Well, what exactly is being clarified? It's not like I don't get a better sense of the truth of Manhattan or the streets around Rockefeller Center or even my own experience in these spaces. I think it helps to remember that coherence is more like a visceral effect than an actual functional scaling up toward reality. Coherence is a feeling. It's an experience that you've taken in something in a satisfactory way. That satisfaction is akin to what Aristotle is talking about when he calls it the beauty of proper order. Or as Tufte puts it, microinformation, like smaller texture in landscape perception, provide a credible refuge where the pace of visualization is condensed, slowed, and personalized. These visual experiences are universal, rooted in human information processing capacities and in the abundance and intricacies of everyday perception. So the idea of accumulation as a refuge suggests the visceral effect of coherence itself. Coherence, from cohere, sticking together. Coherence is accumulation, a sticking together until something feels whole. The constituent elements of epideictic are accumulation, and epideictic as the primal foundation of deliberative and judicial discourse is therefore also based in accumulation, but that accumulation is not demonstrative, it's aesthetic, and its sensation is its effect. This means that our arguments and claims are rooted in the sensational effects of accumulation, which energize claims. So let me add one more thread to this argument about archival magnitude and its aesthetic epistemic. In order to address what exactly we're taking in when megathos is at work, I want to mention Michael Wood's excellent essay, Dead and Alive, Beliefs in Contradictory Conspiracy Theories, which studied a range of conspiracy theorists who simultaneously believe in contradictory versions of events. So Wood and his co-authors found that contradictory beliefs do not indicate a case of troubled dissonance for many conspiracists, but rather that competing viewpoints are unified in support of a conspiracist worldview. In their own research, Wood et al. Found, quote, the more that participants believe that a person at the center of a death-related conspiracy theory, like Princess Di or Osama bin Laden, is still alive, the more they also tend to believe that the same person was killed, so long as the alleged manner of death involves deception by officialdom. Well, logically, bin Laden is either dead or alive, and a single conspiracy theory can't somehow account for both facts at once. It's rational to eliminate one of these alternatives in order to remove a significant cognitive dissonance. Yet both theories, bin Laden is secretly alive, or bin Laden was already dead when SEAL Team 6 arrived, they bolster a larger banner of secrecy within the government. The version of conspiracy is almost beside the point. Secrecy is at work. It's nefarious. It must be revealed. Wood and his co-authors draw from Theodorno's work in The Authoritarian Personality, which examines conflicting anti-Semitic beliefs, such as the belief that Jews are too eager to assimilate and they're also too far removed from the wider culture. Adorno shows that these competing beliefs may contradict each other at one level, If Jews are too far withdrawn, then how are they also too assimilated? Yet they are unified as part of a larger nuclear idea that is strongly mistrustful and rejecting of Jews in general. So for this reason, identifying and analyzing conspiracy theories at local levels of individual claims has only limited value. Wood encourages us to view these claims as extending a wider ideological, or we might say rhetorical gesture. The nonsensical claims about bin Laden as both dead or alive, or about Jews as both too assimilated and too withdrawn, help to sustain a much larger coherent discourse about nefarious machination. The magnitude of dark accumulation sticks together, coheres in a way that feels of the proper order. The effect doesn't come from the content or from the scaled connection. Rather, the effect comes from the accumulation itself, the building up of that archive. Wood's conspiracy nuts are responding to the activity of accumulating. Beauty is in the building of the megathos itself, building an archival magnitude. So here are a few concluding questions that I find myself asking at this point. First, what does it mean to question an archive if scale is not necessarily what is being adhered to most strongly, as in the case of conspiracy theorists? And second, if archives work persuasively through their aesthetic function, is something like revulsion or attraction our best rhetorical counter-strategy? I think we might be seeing something like that in the recent backlash against the anti-vaccination crusaders. The responses are beginning to look a little bit less like an argument with the illogical, irrational, faulty archive that anti-vaccination proponents draw from, and instead we see something more like revulsion, disgust at parents who won't vaccinate. These are aesthetic responses, and one that may have an overall stronger impact. What makes archival magnitude so difficult to address rhetorically is that while we can argue with, disprove the conclusions of a claim, and even with the contents of any particular archive, we have a most difficult time dislodging the aesthetic effects of accumulation. We can critique the scale of a claim, though that critique does not necessarily undo the effects of magnitude. Building the archive, that activity itself is beautiful. And for that reason, it's always right, even when it's wrong. Thanks.
The thing that really jumped out at me is right at the end where you say, oh, well, these people can believe in contradictory claims because it's not really about the claim, it's what the claim helps them to do. And we can see this sort of stuff outside of what we would consider conspiracy theories as well. Yeah. Stereotypes, for instance. Mexicans are lazy. Mexicans are hardworking. And people believe both of these simultaneously, but in different activations. People of the opposing political party are stupid, and they're evil geniuses. In the USSR, we had double consciousness. I'm wondering if you can extend this a little bit further and maybe help us to diagnose what we would consider much more normal discourse.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, even though these are my examples, I don't want to make it seem like I'm only finding pathological discourses as doing these things, because I think that there is something about that we are always building our archives, personally and then culturally, and I don't know that we could do otherwise. So it's not like something that we would want to fix. But what's interesting to me is that I'm curious how much of the building itself is the point, So, and that's what's difficult, because you can say, look, your stereotypes don't even make sense, or whatever it happens to be. But I think this is partly why giving up beliefs are so difficult, or changing beliefs is so difficult. So the vaccination stuff to me is really interesting because the CDC is actually studying this. I mean, they're studying why is it, for example, that, I don't know how many of you heard this, if maybe in July or last summer, but I heard this NPR report talking about how people who already held anti-vaccination beliefs, if they were shown evidence about their safety, they said, I find that persuasive, and I'm also less likely to now vaccinate my children. And the CDC wants to know, but what is that? I mean, I'm showing you, and you're saying that you're persuaded. And so I'm kind of wondering about that, the aesthetic of giving up your archive, of building it, because essentially that's what it would mean. You know, collecting, even down to like collecting news stories about it. You know, there's a process. It's an activity. It's not just a hobby, but it's what energizes so much. And so you're asking people not simply to change their mind or to think differently, you're asking them to give up an activity in some sense.
This is fascinating stuff, and thank you for your talk. I want to ask you to define conspiracy and how you actually differentiate it from, say, dogma or ideology or something like that. And, you know, is creationism, is that a conspiracy theory or something? Because it seems to me that you said something about these conspiracy theories ultimately going back to saying that it's some kind of high-end governmental federal world, you know, thing, and that's behind it, some kind of institution, and that ties it together. And yet that also signals to a different thing that ties these together, which is that they seem to be causal. They're talking about what's behind it, what caused it. And to me that seems forensic rather than epideictic. So I just wonder if you can sort of embroider on some of that.
Well, so I mean, the way that I define it, and it's a good question. You know, how do you define conspiracy discourse? I mean, I think that's why when I was just doing my field work, I tended to talk with people who identified themselves as truthers, which is sort of a name that it started off almost like a derogatory statement, and they said, yes, we're truthers. So people who very openly self-identify as, you know, people who are questioning official versions of various things. It's interesting because some of the stuff that I was reading, the critiques of big data, for example, so Dana Boyd has a really interesting piece where she basically says, you know, people who are interested in all this big data and then find meaning in it, basically see the scale, are kind of doing conspiracy theory themselves, you know, so you see big maps of things, and, you know, conspiracy theorists tend to pull pieces together where most of us say that's coincidence or that has nothing to do with it, but, you know, you're finding lines everywhere. You can kind of do that with big data as well. But the thing about, so, I mean, the discourse, yeah, they'll talk about what happened, so who really shot JFK, or, you know, who's behind 9/11. In terms of the debates, you know, you would call that a forensic debate or judicial or something like that. But what's interesting to me about the stuff that Ned O'Gorman and Jeffrey Walker find about epideictic is to say that it's not simply, you know, that third piece. Like it's not a perfect symmetry, but in fact, deliberative discourse, judicial discourse begins with epideictic discourse, you know. And it's part of that accumulation. So, I mean, but part of that then is that means that the grounds of us as the judging audience is kind of rooted in us as a kind of an enjoying audience, you know, a loving audience. We begin first, which is why I think that's what makes, and not just, you know, conspiracy discourse or the stupid discourses of racism or whatever, but our own as well, you know. So we know something, we don't want to give it up. Logically, we know.
I just want to follow up a little bit that if the causal aspect does become important to you, there's some psychologists who have looked at causal reasoning, and, you know, we jump to suggest causes really, really fast. I mean, humans and particularly Americans, and we tend not to rule them out. It takes a whole lot to rule out a cause. Deanna Kuhn is one of the people who's done some of that stuff, if it's relevant.
Yeah, Thanks.
Yeah, I like the situation in epideictic. One thing that I always stress about epideictic, it's fundamentally about building community, right? Celebrating the communal ties is the most important part of any epideictic, which would explain how the aesthetic of magnitude is more important for bringing people together, right? This is about other people. This is not about data, right? The question I have for you is, you go to Aristotle, talk about the aesthetic dimension of magnitude. Is the argument that it's getting more aesthetic? That the magnitude, the aestheticization of magnitude is increasing in our time? And if so, why?
I don't know, Josh, what do you think?
Well, I mean,
I hadn't
we have
thought
the
about
ambition of truthiness, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of a humorist, but I mean, I think you're onto something. It seems to be that, as we would say in psychoanalytic jargon, right? The decline of symbolic efficiency, the death of the big other, right? The end of authority means that you just get piles and piles of data to get someone to love you because it's no longer about argument, right?
I honestly hadn't thought of it, so I'm going to go back home and think about this some more. I mean, I get.
Well, we're inundated every day with, information overload. Was where it started, and so now we're in this, era of big data. So there's a cultural claim about the intensity of data overwhelming us now. And so I'm just wondering, what does that do to the aesthetic dimension?
Yeah. And the notion of, I'm weaving back and forth between this notion of archives in a very sort of broad, theoretical, abstract sense, and also in a very literal sense. I mean, even my daughter in second grade, in her second grade class, they have archives that they do. So you archive your work. I archive my emails. We are archiving everything. And you have to manage all this data. Even if you're in second grade, you have to manage that data. And it can be overwhelming. I mean, at home, Jeff had a thing where he was like, he pointed to this table. It's covered with papers from a week. We're being drowned in second grade paperwork. There's so much of it. And we mostly just throw it away. And I'm like, should we keep this? And we're supposed to do something with it? I'm not sure. And there's panic that happens. What do I do with this stuff? I don't know. Should I scan it and put it on my computer so I don't know what to do with it. But so there's, the management aspect of it. And there is a very social, those throwing away, all of this paper seems frightening because it has some kind of social ramifications in some sense. I don't know what. It's going to affect her college career somehow.
Maybe another way of asking the question that Josh asked. So if it's the same exact question, just tell me. I'm still going to go think about it. Shut up, right? But all the examples you're using rely on digital networks, social networks, that sort of thing, for the spread of information, for the accumulation of data, that sort of thing. What did conspiracy theorists look like before the rise of these networks and this ability to accumulate data on this scale, right? Obviously, there were still conspiracy theorists before this, and they might it might have grown in intensity, but does the larger project look to maybe not even historical examples 100 years ago, but even 30 years ago?
Yeah.
What would that look like?
So I went to two conferences. I went to a 9/11 truth conference, and then I went to sort of a general conspiracy conference, which was like anybody who wants to come talk about different conspiracies. And some of these people have been going for a long time to these events. They know each other, and they will set up tables with, CDs that they've burned, and they'll give you their CDs. But sometimes people, there is Conspiracy Con, which is a big one that happens in California. But they'll do their own newsletters. They stay in contact with that. So you can kind of tell the people who've been doing this for a long time. It's very social. They know each other. The very few people I talked to had a story about being alone. Some people describe themselves as very isolated, and yet the story of their experience in conspiracy networks were all about others, and that's the whole goal, is that you were telling others, you can't be a good conspiracist and a hermit, really. Well, that's kind of interesting.
Sorry, I think
Yeah.
I have the mic.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'd like to sort of piggyback on all three of your questions, Davida, Josh, and Casey. So Davida asked about a definition for a conspiracy. Sorry, I guess I should use this. And suggested that there was a forensic dimension that we needed to touch on. Then Josh talked about whether or not in the 21st century, rather than magnitude being a very particular proportion, that we instead might say that magnitude and aesthetics scale equally, or do they? And then Casey asked, before social networks, how would you trace such a phenomenon, et cetera? I found myself thinking about your project in terms of different publics and how epideictic rhetoric is so important to both recognizing publics as they form and also describing those publics, much like what Josh said. But I also thought about how what happens when we view the social networks that you're using to trace those conspiracy theories and instead look at the discourse of those social networks on their own documentation. So in other words, conspiracy theorists who may refuse to have a Facebook page but will document endlessly other things on their own personal web page, obviously not fearing a web presence, but rather wanting to cultivate one's own archive. So I wondered how much looking at like an archive of self, or someone wanting to own the archive of self in the world of the World Wide Web, matters to a project like this, and what might happen, or I mean, obviously I haven't seen your entire project, but how much it focuses on looking at both people wanting to control the archive of self as it exists on the internet, especially conspiracy theorists self-identified, and how much that practice is supposed to counteract the existence of an a priori, like, secret archive, which would be institutional at first, right? We, before the age of the internet, would say the CIA always has a secret archive that we can't see. No matter how much of it they release, we always have something that's unreleased, right? So we have to counteract it with this evidence that we're finding ourselves. But now that institutional authority exists in the internet itself, that there's a secret archive of you that you might not even have access to. Do you feel that maybe this move towards accumulation of evidence is always contrasting a thing that can never be uncovered, and that's sort of the rhetorical move? And that's a huge question.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about it, and I mean, I can tell you in my interactions, in my interviews, in my field work with people who do have various levels of interest in conspiracy theories. I'm trying to get my head around your question.
I know I constellated it in this awkward way.
When I first started out, my plan was, I actually did an IRB thing with this, and I went through the right channels. The first thing the guy said was, we don't see many English people, folks from English giving us IRB things. And I said, I'm actually in rhetoric, so I'm not just English. And then he looked at it, and then he gave me a call like 2 weeks later and said, I really need to talk with you about this. Because what I wanted to do was to go interview, I wanted them to show me their home archive. What is it that you have at home? So do you have stacks of paper? Will you show me your computers? And he kind of walked me through the process, and I thought, okay, well, we finally got clearance for this IRB. That's the big hurdle. Actually, the big hurdle is getting people who are paranoid about things to show you their archives. So the interesting thing is that, yeah, they're very protective of their own archive and are very aware of that they have information. That's what makes it valuable. And they also believe that their life is archived in some way. I remember one conversation, it was a phone or a Skype interview, and a guy said, to be honest, I don't really know who you are. I'm just taking for granted that you are who you say you are. They're listening to our conversation right now. They could drop bombs on both of our houses if we want to. I was thinking, God, if you only knew how little power I had. I mean, that same week, we were told that we could no longer order cookies for a meeting without permission. I'm like, I have no power. Nobody's listening to my phone calls at all. But in his mind, that his life, it's hyper, there in their minds, everything is so hyper archived that every little conversation, somehow the government's keeping track of. And it's, talk about scaling, it's like hyper scale. You think your life is so insignificant in the big scheme of things, and mine is too.
That sort of relies on the archive having to be secret, right? So whether it's the CIA or the part of the internet that is you that you can't see, it's sort of has the same rhetorical function.
Yeah, for them, what interests me about it is the idea of the way that it inflates and conflates, especially in people's minds. And especially given, to give you another example of how the scale kind of gets wacky sometimes, at one of the conferences, this guy kind of pulled me aside and said, if you're really interested in this stuff, I'll send you all kinds of things. I'll send it to your work. I won't send it to your home, but I won't mark it on the packet. He was very sort of paranoid about it. And he said, promise me you won't show this to anybody. This is I trust you, blah, blah, blah. And so I'm not really sure what I'm going to get in the mail. And I'm sort of thinking, what is this? And I get it. And then it's just sort of like photocopied things, stuff he's printed out from the internet, stuff. And I'm like, oh, this is, in his mind, though, this was huge. Took on such, and in reality, I thought, wow, it's so interesting. I see nothing in it. And to think about, what I loved about that quote that Aristotle had about what's beautiful. Can something really small be beautiful? Can something really large be beautiful? Basically the idea is what we take in is beautiful. He took that in as beautiful. To me, it was so imperceptibly small, I couldn't even take it in. It was like, this is nothing. This wasn't even worth you spending money on an envelope and sending it to me. In his mind, though, he took this in as something huge that he'd be willing to share because he trusted me. And so it's that kind of scale that interests me, and I think it has that aesthetic dimension to it. Yeah.
Why do you think he trusted you?
I talked to him for a while. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe I'm a friendly person. I did not have any. I seemed really shady because I didn't have any business cards with me. He goes, "You have a business card?" I said, "I don't. I really don't." And he's the guy who said he did have a business card because he has his own little newspaper, and he said, "You should really get business cards." So I don't know. He trusted me.
So well recognizing that business cards are available readily, wanted you to procure one as a sign that you were credible.
Yeah, yeah. Like I was getting the professional advice from this guy who had top secret information about 9/11.
Okay. So I'm just curious. You talked earlier in your lecture about accumulation loss for beautiful clarity and about the aesthetically ugly rhetoric of conspiracy theories. So since why does accumulation within conspiracy theories, why is that not beautiful, and why is the accumulation that when they do from geomapping and they do on Twitter and the data they collect from social networks, why is that beautiful?
I think it's all beautiful. What's the beautiful part of it is not beauty in the sense of beauty versus ugly, but if you can think of it more like when something seems coherent to you, the sense, when something makes sense and it sounds coherent, there's this kind of satisfaction, almost like this visceral satisfaction that, you finally understand what somebody's trying to say, or you understand a movie, or you understand something. And I think that, to me, this is how I hear Aristotle saying that there's that satisfaction. I take it in. I'm stretching a little bit what he's saying because he's really talking about the eye taking it in. So like a flea couldn't be beautiful, or like a germ couldn't be beautiful, or a mile couldn't be beautiful. But if we kind of abstract that a little bit, for them, that's beautiful. So for that guy who sent me those 10 pages of stuff printed out from the internet, that was beautiful to him because he took it in some way. It stuck together in a way that felt whole. I didn't feel that. I didn't get it. It didn't feel whole to me. It didn't feel coherent at all. And it didn't feel satisfactory in that way. So, it's like but that's the aesthetic dimension. Is that painting beautiful? Maybe. It is to to someone, it's beautiful. It is, if you say it's beautiful, you know. But that's an aesthetic component. And I think, you know, so what I'm trying to say about the accumulation, things accumulate in a way that create that sense of coherence, the beauty, and it's always right. So David Hume says, you know, sentiment, it's always right. It's real and it's always right, and you can't really argue with it. You can argue with the judgments that come after based on it, but, you know, the judgment, your sentiment that that's a beautiful painting is right.
I guess what I've been thinking as I've been listening, especially after the talk, but it crossed my mind during the talk, and now it's coming back more. Where's the sublime in all of this? Because when it gets too big, I mean, when it gets too big, and of course, big data offers you this ginormous scope of things in an understood way, right?
Yeah.
You can see it. There are links, right? But when you close in on the links like Zoom, there's again so many. It's a you know, it can really knock you out in a way. So I wonder if it plays.
Yeah. Yes. I don't know what to make. I mean, here's a question for you. Let's say I'm working on a project like this. I mean, one of the questions I had is, if I want to talk about magnitude and scale and beauty and aesthetics and what we can take in, I mean, you're skirting right along the edge of the other, which is that which we can't take in, the sublime, the overwhelming thing, which is not beautiful. I guess there's no way not to deal with it in some sense, but I haven't done it yet. So what would a sublime archive look like? Is there a sublime archive? I mean, I came close to it when this summer I went to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem, and in one of the rooms they have there's a few different places they have this effect of what I would call sublime, but one of them is where they have a room where every single name of every victim is written down. And you walk into this room and it's kind of round and it's just, there's nothing fancy about the room. It's books full of names and it's overwhelming. To the point of where that's the point, is to be overwhelmed by just the names. And the same with the children's Holocaust Memorial, which is in a different place. You walk in and it's total pitch black, but there's mirrors everywhere, which you can't really tell. And there's a single candle flame, and it's reproduced, looks millions of times. It's overwhelming, so you could never count. And this is a kind of archive, archiving these memories. But it's an archive that you could never take in, really. So I don't have an answer right now. It's something I need.
But I think maybe you're working on one, because what you just described is specifically designed to overwhelm you. But what's going on in these conspiracy theories, where there are lines pointing everywhere, is perhaps a kind of defense against precisely this sublime. I remember once early morning on a beach, and the sun was coming up, but it hadn't really dawned on me. And I looked out into this vast expanse of sea, and I go, oh, look, there's a little island right there. And Paul goes, what? And I go, right there, where there's a light. And he goes, it's the sun. I'm like, what? And he's like, what, are you an idiot? But what I had done is bring it in, like those closed glasses on the stagecoaches that made you not be able to see all of the Alps, right? Because then you would be overwhelmed. So there's a way that we do these things that makes me wonder about precisely conspiracy theories, right? And I'm sure it works in other arenas, but the idea that there is a mystery, but it's not too big to understand. You can see how they all fit. Everything works together, and there's a kind of like panicked hold on it.
Yeah, I mean, that would be the aesthetic
Yeah.
dimension, is the aesthetic operates as a sort of speed
Yes.
bump to sublimity. Right? But they have to work dialectically together in conspiracy, which you don't have in other discourses, in the sense that the sublimity can never go away, or it stops, like the whole shebang stops. So the aestheticization of the sublime, which is ultimately nothing, the real void, what have you, is the production of these discourses along the way, or dying sun, right?
Well, I mean, it was interesting when I was right in the heart of the 9/11 stuff. I was thinking, what if they felt like they solved it, like they got it? That would be the worst day of their lives, because this all goes away. The activity of it goes away, and so you do have to skirt very carefully between the beautiful and the sublime. It has to remain almost out of reach, but close enough to where you can keep building it.
So I was curious as you're doing this project, how do you reconcile the notions of rationality and reasonableness, or the idea of reasoning with someone, which is so prevalent in rhetorical theory and rhetorical studies, with the pathologies that are frequently associated with things like paranoia, as you're writing after your field work? In other words, like, how are you reconciling, basically, in a certain sense, there are certain types of perceptions of the sublime which, if they're too far outside the norm, they become phobias. They become called phobias, acrophobia, agoraphobia, etc. That these are people who get overwhelmed by a certain sense of sublime, but we don't consider that to be within the realm of normalcy, but rather there's something wrong with them, right? And so how are you dealing with that in your project, and the ethics of or responsibilities that might come with that?
Well, to be completely honest with you, I wasn't really sure what I was getting myself into, and I don't think I knew a lot of people who were true conspiracy theorists before I started. And I became though I've got, interesting people, I met all kinds of different types of people. I mean, there's all types of people who get involved in conspiracy theorists at various levels. And that became clear to me very early on, is that, wow, any preconceived notion I had about, these are all just sort of like paranoid people who have mental illnesses quickly became dissolved. Now, there's a lot of other reasons why you get involved in that. The flip side is that we're all conspiracy theorists of some kind. And I mean, academics are some of the worst at it. They're more acceptable conspiracy theorists, but we have those too. I mean, maybe we're a little savvier at handling them. Sometimes we're not. So the conspiracy type of logic, the accumulation, the making connections between things that don't necessarily exist, I mean, we all do that all the time as well.
Well, statistically speaking, like something like 70% of grad students are on some kind of psychiatric medication. So we might not be the best group to base normal on. But I think I was really thinking about this more in terms of how you're reconciling the baseline notion of rationality with contradictory, when someone holds two beliefs that are factually contradictory at the same time. How are you reconciling that with pathologies of power?
I mean, to go back to the question of actually dealing rationally, what I ended up doing in all of the situations was just very description-based. So I would ask people to describe. I really wanted to know. I actually started this out wanting to know their research process. So I say, how do you do your research? Do you sit at a computer? Do you go have a group that you meet up with? What kinds of things do you engage with? What kind of things do you read? Where do you find your information? And then as it grew, I had a real fundamental curiosity about how do you gather? And to be honest with you, the fact that I landed as 9/11 truthers was almost because that was the group that would talk to me. I also asked a selection of people who were involved in the anti-vaccination movement, the same to ask questions, because to me it's always about the building. It's not so much about the content, and they would not talk to me. Truthers were extremely open, and I was open about what I was doing as well, who I was, and only on a few occasions did somebody say, "Well, what do you really think?" For the most part, they didn't really care what I thought, whether I agreed or disagreed. Never had a debate with anybody. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but I mean, I was very hands off and always very careful to say, I'm just interested in hearing. I'm sort of neutral on this issue.
Okay, so what's the question? So studies have shown like that false information can spread fast through social networks like Facebook. So how does your research about conspiracy theories apply to college students and social networks?
How does it apply to them? That's a good question. I don't know. I would say, one thing that I was very interested in was the ways that information got shared very, very rapidly. So I started doing this research, and almost exactly at the same time, the Boston Marathon bombing happened. And I immediately thought, well, here's a really interesting test case in the wild that you could watch it grow. And in a very short period of time, these conspiracies were there. Like I showed you the crisis actors. And then when the Sandy Hook shooting happened, it was the same thing. Then I realized why it's so easy for these narratives to spring up overnight. How is it that suddenly you have this conspiracy of all these things? It's because it's kind of it's a template that they're drawing from, right? So false flag, you can almost write itself. The next, unfortunately, hopefully we'll never have anything that happens terrible, but let's just say that some major crisis happens with us. Look, it'll be, it's false flag, the government actually, the government actually did it, but they're going to blame it on somebody else. Crisis actors are now something that gets part of this network. So there's victims, but they're not really victims. They're just hired to look like victims. And they're really alive. Everybody's fine. This is, a clamp down on civil liberties. So it all writes itself very quickly. And I think if you don't know that already, if you're somebody we sometimes say, be critical about the information you take in. So when I teach students, I say, think critically. And occasionally somebody will say, what does that mean, think critically? What are you talking about exactly? And part of it is that, sort of say, do you understand where this information comes from? It's not enough to say, don't believe everything you read on the internet, but to say, where do these narratives come from exactly? So, when you see a picture comparing two different things, it helps to know that that's part of a template that's been going on for a very long time. You don't actually have to argue, look, these are not the same people, it doesn't make sense or anything like that. It helps to know a little bit, to stop and say, where did this information come from? Does that make sense a little bit?
Yeah, it does make sense. Sorry, I'm just a little undergrad, so.
No, I'm trying to think about, so I taught a class last year called Rhetoric and Bullshit. And so we looked at instances of bullshit, and conspiracy theories are definitely part of that. But part of the reason why I wanted to teach a class on bullshit was because it helps to know what bullshit is exactly and where it comes from. And so we spent a lot of time we spent a lot of time looking at, and also what are the effects of it? So even if you don't necessarily believe everything you read on the internet, what are the effects of this? So Josh asked a question earlier about, things growing. That was a question we had. Is there really more bullshit today than ever before? Say because of things like social media. And you do see, it was amazing to me when I started to collect all the tweets about the Boston Marathon bombing, all the conspiracy theorists talk about archiving, I was overwhelmed, where I started to think, I can't even grab these fast enough. You know, and I went to my friends in geography and I said, because they have big computers, they grab everything. I said, can you pull down everything that's hashtag, false flag, Boston Marathon bombing? And they said, yeah, but it's going to be huge. And also, we only get the geotag stuff, which is like 1%. So, I mean, so all the tweets that are not geotagged, that they're not grabbing, are thousands. And that just is in the space of a day, you know. So if you think about, well, this is interesting. As we live, you know, you guys living social era, right? Social media. We all are. You have to. I mean, I don't know if I'm answering your question exactly, but this is what I think. Not that students get sucked into conspiracy theories, but that studying bullshit sometimes is helpful. Was that a bad answer?
Sure. Yeah, that actually does answer a lot of my questions I have about on social media. But I had a follow-up question. You brought up something important. So you talked about conspiracy theories, and you also mentioned secrecy. Like there's this huge archive of secrecy that seems overwhelming. And conspiracy theorists, you said they seem to be overwhelmed by that, and that's why they turn to alternate theories, which are just as intricate, I suppose. Why do you think that they why? But the paradox I see is that we have FOIA, we have the Freedom of Information Act. We can request a lot of information from our government. Why has that not tamped down on the number of conspiracy theories we have today about things like 9/11 and stuff like that?
So my answer would be that, you know, for conspiracy theorists, and this is one of the things that I think I'm trying to argue in my paper, is that for conspiracy theorists, it's really about the activity of the searching, the building of that archive. So the fact that you can request documents from the government means that there's something there to be requested, and you can continue to request it, you share it, you circulate it. That's really the activity of doing conspiracy theory. So, you know, I said just now, I mean, if 9/11 truthers ever decided they got all the information they needed and they solved the mystery, that would be a terrible day, because the activity of building that archive is suddenly gone. So, yeah, I don't know. So the stuff that this guy sent me in the mail, a lot of it came, he said he got it under the Freedom of Information Act. He was able to Xerox copies of things. But that kind of added to the mystery of it, you know, requesting these things. So rather than him feeling like he had a better insight into the government, it just seemed murkier. It's almost like the more information conspiracy theorists have, the murkier it gets for them. You know?
So it's like not so much the truth itself, is the fact that they're discovering the truth, the process of discovering the truth. Is that what really motivates them?
I think so, yeah. I mean,
They sound like academics.
right.
Okay. Maybe just one more if it's not too big. Magnitude.
I was thinking about. I was thinking about things like, you know, revisionist historiographical projects of various kinds in terms of, you know, feminist historiography, or, you know, revisionary historiographies located in critical race theory and things like that. And I was interested in what you were saying about, you know, at some point this accumulation passes over, I think was the phrase from, you know, this sort of project of scaling to truth or to reality into the sort of aesthetic epidictic function. Do you think that's also true in the accumulation of I guess I'll just use feminist revisionary histories as the example, that the more examples you have where you pull, you know, woman rhetor out of the archive and kind of, you know, like throw her on the pile of other, you know, woman rhetors that's like constantly accumulating, if at some point those projects also pass over from a sort of like effective politics into something else.
I do think that there's something to accumulation of all types, that it does, like, And I don't think that you leave behind the other function that it has to do. But I think there's a degree of accumulation where you're no longer talking simply about the quality of something or the quantity of something. Then it becomes this sort of qualitative something else. I don't like the way Jorgensen says it's a different kind of knowledge, but you could think of it that way, that it's still functioning like big data. So that's why I like the brains versus salads map. It's interesting because it is a real it's a real representation of all the geotag y'all quotes between these two spaces of years. But when you think about how many tweets that actually is, and it passes over into something else. I mean, maybe in this instance, it's simply pleasure, bliss of some kind, being able to see all of that information coded. But I do, that's what I'm trying to figure out, what is that? And then what effect does that something else, when it passes over? I kind of like that, there's a point where it becomes something different. It does something different.
Is it like a fantasy of infinite invention?
No, what do you mean?
Well, when we think about invention in the rhetorical tradition, it's about finding all the possible arguments.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some sense in which, with these big data projects and with the conspiracy theory, or even with academic fantasies, there's this idea that we can keep going out and looking for these possibilities, and they're infinitely out there for us to keep looking at. And so it's a little bit different from a finished, polished argument, right? It's actually the production phase, not so much the end product.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks everyone for coming.